The cowboy rode slowly along the riverbank, the crunch of damp gravel marking each step of his horse. The late sun shimmered on the golden water, scattering reflections that danced like restless spirits. His hand rested on the reins, hat brim shadowing his stern face. The horse snorted and shifted, sensing tension in the air, as if both man and beast understood this was no ordinary moment. Then, he saw them. 3 young Apache women stood waist-deep in the river, their long black hair dripping down over their shoulders, glistening in the fading light. Their buckskin dresses, darkened by the water, clung to them, while strands of bright beads hung across their chests, swaying gently with the ripples. They did not laugh, did not startle at his presence. Instead, their eyes locked on him in complete silence, as if they had been waiting all along. The cowboy's hand hovered near the rope coiled at his saddle but never drew it. There was no immediate threat, only the heavy stillness of an encounter steeped in centuries of distrust. The tension revealed itself in the smallest details, the nervous flick of the horse's ears, the steady flow of the river, the unwavering gaze of the 3 women. They did not flinch, did not step back. They stood rooted in the current like the river itself had chosen them as its guardians. He inhaled slowly, searching for words to cut through the silence, but nothing came. The moment stretched longer, each second an unspoken challenge. One wrong move could tip the balance into conflict. The cowboy knew rivers carried stories of survival, betrayal, ambushes, and he had the sinking sense that his story was about to be claimed by these waters. A breeze swept through the trees lining the bank, rustling the leaves, yet the world remained unnervingly still. It was a scene frozen in time, 1 man armed and mounted, 3 women unarmed but unshaken. Their dignity was untouchable, their presence so commanding that even his revolver seemed meaningless. That was when the cowboy realized this was no chance meeting. There was no surprise in their eyes, only certainty. They had been waiting for him. And the truth hit him harder than any bullet: they hadn't come for the river. They had come for him. The morning sun crept over the horizon, casting a pale light across the open prairie. Dust floated lazily in the air as the cowboy leaned against a weathered fence post, tightening the barbed wire that sagged after a long winter. His shirt clung to his back with sweat, and the steady creak of the wood echoed in rhythm with the call of meadowlarks overhead. Life on the ranch was never quiet, but it was steady, predictable. Every sound, from the thud of the hammer to the groan of the boards, felt like part of a rhythm he had lived his whole life. When the work was done, he mounted his horse and rode into town. The streets were quiet, lined with the familiar sight of wagons, cracked hitching posts, and children darting between storefronts with laughter that cut through the dry heat. He tipped his hat to an older woman sweeping her porch, past the blacksmith's shop where sparks showered onto the dirt, and made his way to the general store. It was just another day, but he felt a weight in the air, something unseen pressing down, like the hush before a storm. Inside the store, talk buzzed low among a few men clustered near the counter. Words like raiders, railroad, and land disputes drifted through the room, and though no one spoke directly to him, he felt their eyes follow as he paid for nails and feed. He had grown used to suspicion. The West was a land where trust came slow and rumors traveled faster than the wind. Still, there was something different in the way the whispers clung today, heavy and deliberate, as though people already knew something he didn't. On his way back, he paused at the riverbank to water his horse. That was when he noticed the sign of disturbance: broken reeds pressed flat, footprints half washed away by the current. He crouched down, running his calloused fingers over the wet earth. Not the tracks of cattle, not settlers' boots. Smaller. Lighter. He didn't need to be told who they belonged to. The river had always been a meeting place, a line between 2 worlds, and something told him it was about to become more than that. As he rose, he heard laughter carried faintly on the breeze. Turning his head, he glimpsed 3 figures slipping back into the water, their braids glistening in the sun. They didn't flee, didn't hide completely. It was almost as if they wanted him to see them, as if their presence was a message carved into the flowing river itself. He narrowed his eyes, unsettled. Encounters like this were never accidental. The cowboy mounted again, but unease followed him like a shadow. He couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow would not be another ordinary day. Something was stirring, pulling him into a current he couldn't resist. And for the first time in years, the river didn't feel like a border, it felt like a warning. The cowboy rose before dawn, the horizon still painted in faint strokes of gray. He saddled his horse in silence, the leather creaking as he tightened the cinch. The unease from the day before clung to him like a second skin. He could still see the footprints at the riverbank, still hear the echo of laughter that didn't belong to the settlers in town. He knew what it meant. The Apaches were close, closer than the townsfolk dared to imagine. And yet, part of him wondered if their presence was a threat or something else entirely. By midday, the town buzzed with rumors sharper than spurs. At the saloon, voices rose over clinking glasses. A rancher claimed he saw smoke signals on the ridge, a railroad man muttered about stolen supplies, a deputy insisted an attack was imminent. Each man carried his own version of truth, but none of them agreed on what should be done. Some wanted the cavalry called in, others demanded the locals arm themselves. Through it all, the cowboy sat quietly in the corner, hat brim low, listening. He knew fear had a way of twisting facts into weapons. On his way out, a neighbor caught his arm. Old Samuel Briggs, a rancher with weathered eyes, spoke low and urgent. "You've got no business meddling with them, son. Best keep your head down and let the law handle what's coming." His words carried the weight of caution, of survival born from loss. Yet only an hour later, the sheriff himself pulled the cowboy aside, his voice carrying a different tune. "If you see anyone, you let me know. Folks say you've got a way of catching signs others miss. Don't hold back if it keeps this town safe." Conflicting voices gnawed at him, but the decision grew heavier when he returned to the river that afternoon. The three women were there again, standing in the shallows with the same silent defiance. One of them, the tallest, held his gaze longer this time, her expression unreadable. It was not the look of an enemy, but of someone testing his resolve. He could ride away, pretend none of this was his burden, or he could step into the current and face whatever truth waited beneath its surface. He dismounted slowly, boots sinking into the mud. Every instinct screamed that this was the turning point. If he chose to engage, there would be no going back. The women watched him, their stillness louder than words, as if daring him to bridge the gap between their worlds. The horse shifted restlessly behind him, as if sensing the weight of the choice. The cowboy exhaled, tasting dust and river mist on the same breath. He knew then that neutrality was no longer an option. One step forward meant danger, maybe even war. But one step away meant cowardice, and he couldn't live with that. The river waited, carrying the sound of fate in its steady flow. The next morning dawned heavy with haze, the kind that clung low to the ground in muffled sound. The cowboy rode out before the sun had cleared the horizon, scanning the ridgelines with narrowed eyes. What he saw set his gut on edge, thin trails of smoke rising where no settler cabins stood. It was a signal, too deliberate to be chance. The river wasn't just a border anymore, it was becoming the center of a storm. His horse shifted beneath him, ears flicking nervously, as though the animal too sensed something moving closer. By the time he returned to town, the whispers had spread like fire on dry grass. Merchants closed shutters early, mothers kept children inside, and ranchers gathered in tense clusters on the street corners. No one spoke openly, but everyone knew. The sheriff barked orders, trying to maintain calm, yet his own hand hovered near his holster. It wasn't just fear of raiding parties, it was the realization that something larger was taking shape, something that reached beyond cattle theft or boundary disputes. The air itself felt weighted with waiting violence. That afternoon, the cowboy returned to the river. The three women were not there this time. Instead, he found fresh signs along the bank, hoofprints from more than a dozen riders. The prints cut deep into the wet soil, deliberate and heavy, leading away from the water toward the north. He crouched, tracing the marks with his fingers. Whoever they were, they had been close, closer than anyone in town would dare believe. He stood, scanning the horizon, but the trees beyond swayed with an unnatural quiet, as though holding their secrets close. Later, in the saloon, a railroad man spoke too loudly after too many drinks. He claimed the company had struck a deal to push tracks through Apache hunting grounds. "Land's just land," the man sneered, slamming his glass on the counter. "They'll move or they'll be moved." The cowboy listened, his jaw tightening. Suddenly, the women's silence made sense. This wasn't just about trespass, it was about survival. The railroad had set something in motion that could not be solved with a handshake. That evening, as the cowboy led his horse back to the ranch, the sound of distant drums echoed faintly through the hills. It was soft, almost hidden by the wind, but steady enough to chill the marrow in his bones. He stopped in the trail, listening, heart thudding with the rhythm. This was no coincidence. The signs were too many, too close. Trouble was no longer on the horizon, it was at his doorstep. When he finally dismounted at the barn, the sun had bled into red across the sky. Shadows stretched long, and the silence pressed heavy. He looked back toward the river, his hand brushing the revolver at his side. The time for ignoring had passed. Whatever storm was brewing, it was about to break wide open, and he knew he was already standing in the middle of it. The confrontation came sooner than the cowboy expected. He had ridden out at dawn, intending to scout the northern ridge where the hoofprints had led. The land there was rough, carved with gullies and scattered with mesquite brush. He moved slow, letting his horse pick the safest path, eyes scanning every shadow. That was when he heard it, the crack of a twig not far ahead, followed by the unmistakable rhythm of hooves. He pulled his reins tight, guiding his horse into the shelter of a rocky outcrop. The riders appeared moments later, a half-dozen men, their faces painted, their movements sharp and deliberate. They hadn't seen him yet. The cowboy debated whether to turn back quietly, but his hesitation cost him. A low whistle cut through the morning air, and in an instant, every head turned his way. Their horses surged forward, surrounding him in a tight circle. Spears and rifles gleamed in the pale light, and one man barked a command in Apache that the cowboy couldn't understand. Still, the meaning was clear enough, he was trapped. His hand hovered near his revolver, but he knew drawing would be suicide. One of the riders pushed forward, a younger man with fierce eyes and a feather tied into his braid. He shouted again, this time in broken English. "Why here? Why spy?" The accusation burned hot, and the cowboy felt every gaze heavy on him. He opened his mouth to answer, to explain he meant no harm, but the words faltered. Any explanation would sound hollow. He hadn't come to fight, but he had come close enough to look like a threat. Before he could respond, another rider older, scarred across the cheek, spoke sharply to the younger man. The exchange was heated, rapid, but the cowboy caught fragments: river, tracks, railroad. They were arguing about him, about what to do, about the danger his presence meant. The younger man leaned forward, snarling, as if ready to strike, but the older one raised a hand, halting the circle's violence. That small gesture gave the cowboy a breath of space, but it also deepened the tension. One wrong move could tilt the balance fatally. The cowboy chose his words carefully, his voice low and steady. "I'm not here for your land. Not here to steal. I saw the tracks. I wanted to know the truth." His words hung in the air, fragile, almost drowned by the restless stamping of hooves. For a moment, he thought he saw doubt flicker in the older rider's eyes. But the younger man spat on the ground, growling, "Lies. Always lies." The circle pressed tighter, the smell of sweat and dust closing in. Then came the sound, hoofbeats in the distance, approaching fast. The riders stiffened, turning their heads toward the ridge. The cowboy's pulse raced. He realized this encounter wasn't finished, it was only interrupted. As the younger man glared at him with unmasked fury, the cowboy understood one thing with certainty: this conflict would not end with words alone. A bigger showdown was inevitable. The cowboy didn't sleep that night. He sat on the porch of his cabin, lantern light flickering against the boards, replaying every moment of the standoff in his mind. The image of the younger Apache's glare burned sharper than the flame before him. He knew it was only a matter of time before the circle of riders returned, and next time, words might not be enough to hold steel back. But it wasn't the threat alone that gnawed at him, it was the fragments of words he'd overheard. Railroad. Tracks. The realization pressed heavier with every breath. This wasn't just about territory. It was about betrayal. At dawn, he rode into town determined to find answers. The sheriff avoided his questions, claiming ignorance, but the railroad foreman was less cautious. Over a bottle of cheap whiskey, loosened by his own arrogance, the man admitted what few dared speak aloud. The company had struck a deal, not with the townsfolk, but with Washington men in polished boots. They'd been promised free rein to carve steel across Apache hunting grounds, claiming the land as unused. The cowboys' chests tightened. It was theft disguised as progress, and it was happening under their noses. Worse still, the foreman smirked when he spoke of scouts hired to provoke skirmishes, small raids that would justify calling in the cavalry. "Push 'em out clean," the man bragged, as though uprooting a people was no different than clearing brush. The cowboy clenched his fists under the table, his jaw set like stone. He had no illusions left. The women at the river hadn't been a threat, they had been a warning. And now he understood why they'd waited for him. He was standing on ground already chosen for blood. Back on the ranch, he found Samuel Briggs waiting, the old rancher's face lined with grim urgency. "They'll drag us all into war," Samuel said, lowering his voice. "The railroad doesn't care if it's Apache or settler blood that stains the dirt, so long as the tracks keep moving. You'd best stay clear of this, son. Pick a side, and you'll lose everything." His words carried the weary truth of experience, but the cowboy knew silence would only feed the fire. Staying clear wasn't an option anymore. That evening, the distant drums returned, steadier now, closer. He stood at the riverbank again, and this time the three women stepped forward to meet him. The tallest lifted her chin, eyes sharp with both anger and sorrow. "They take our land. They burn our homes. You ride with them or you stand against them." Her English was broken, but her meaning cut clean. The choice was laid bare: side with the railroad in town, or risk everything to stand beside those marked as enemies. The cowboy felt the weight of both worlds pressing on his shoulders. The law would brand him a traitor if he sided with the Apache. The railroad would crush him if he resisted. Yet his silence now would make him complicit in their ruin. His pulse hammered in his ears as he looked into the woman's steady gaze. He had to decide, and once he did, there would be no turning back. The cowboy's decision weighed on him like a brand pressed into flesh. He had chosen, though he hadn't spoken it aloud. By meeting the women at the river, by not turning them away, he had already stepped across a line that could never be erased. That night, under a sky thick with stars, he packed light, just enough ammunition, jerky, and water for the trail. Every creak of leather and jingle of the saddle reminded him of the gamble he was about to make. If the town discovered where his loyalties leaned, they'd call him a traitor. If the Apache doubted him, he'd be dead before sunrise. The first sign of consequence came quickly. As he rode past the Briggs ranch, he caught sight of Samuel on the porch, arms crossed, ice hard. The old man didn't wave, didn't call out. Instead, he spat into the dirt, a silent judgment that stung worse than words. The cowboy knew the look, disappointment mixed with suspicion. He tipped his hat out of habit, but Samuel turned away. Trust was already crumbling, and the weight of isolation pressed down heavier than the night air. By midday, he had reached the hills near the river, where the drums had echoed before. He dismounted, leading his horse quietly along a narrow ravine. Suddenly, voices rose around him, shouted commands, rifles cocking. He froze as shadows moved along the ridge. Apache riders encircled him again, but this time the circle was tighter, sharper, the air alive with the promise of violence. The younger warrior with the feather braid glared down at him, bow drawn taut. "Why come back?" he demanded, venom in every word. The cowboy raised his hands slowly, palms open. "Because I know the truth now," he said, his voice steady despite the knot in his chest. "The railroad plans to burn your land, blame you for it, and call soldiers to finish the rest. They'll take everything. And they'll turn on me and mine when you're gone." The words cracked the silence, carried by the river breeze. Some of the riders shifted uneasily, trading glances, but the younger warrior's bow didn't lower. His doubt was a blade hovering above the cowboy's throat. Pain came fast. One rider dismounted and struck him across the face with a rifle butt, dropping him to his knees. Blood filled his mouth, the taste of iron mixing with dust. Laughter followed from some, but the older, scarred warrior silenced them with a single command. He studied the cowboy, eyes narrowed, searching for deceit. Minutes dragged like hours until, finally, he gave a short nod. "If you lie," he said, voice deep and harsh, "you die slow." Bruised, humiliated, and with every advantage stripped from him, the cowboy still found a spark of resolve. As he staggered back to his feet, he realized this was the edge, maximum risk, no way back. If he failed to prove himself now, he would not only lose his life but doom any chance of peace. With nothing left but desperation, he knew what he had to do: gamble everything on a plan that might just keep the West from burning. The cowboy's gamble carried him straight into the heart of danger. The Apache riders bound his hands and marched him into their camp, a hidden clearing by the river where fires burned low and the smell of smoke clung to the trees. The entire village seemed to be waiting, men with rifles resting across their knees, women watching with hard eyes, children peering out from behind hides. At the center stood the tribal council, their leader cloaked in beads and eagle feathers, his gaze cutting through the crowd like a blade. The cowboy felt the weight of every stare pressing against him. This was no chance to plead, it was a trial. He was shoved forward to kneel in the dirt. The younger warrior, feather braid swaying, shouted in Apache, pointing at the cowboy like he was nothing more than a pest to be crushed. The words came fast, sharp, and the camp stirred with angry murmurs. Though the cowboy couldn't understand every phrase, he knew enough to sense the accusations: spy, liar, thief. When the noise grew too loud, the elder leader raised his hand, silencing the camp with a single gesture. His voice was calm but commanding as he asked, in halting English, "Why are you here?" The cowboy lifted his head, blood dried along his temple from the earlier blow. "Because the railroad is lying to both of us," he said firmly. "They'll burn your homes and blame you. They'll send soldiers to kill you. And when you're gone, they'll come for us, too. Settlers, ranchers, none of us will matter. Only the tracks." His words echoed in the clearing, but he saw skepticism flicker in the crowd. They'd heard promises before, from men who spoke of peace with one hand and carried a knife in the other. The younger warrior spat into the dirt. "Lies," he growled, his voice carrying fury that demanded blood. He pulled a knife from his belt and stepped closer, but before he could strike, another voice rose from the crowd, a woman's voice. The cowboy turned, stunned. It was one of the three women from the river. She stepped forward, her chin lifted, her eyes locked on the leader. In Apache, she spoke quickly, passionately, gesturing toward the cowboy, then toward the horizon where the smoke trails had risen days before. Her voice trembled not with fear, but with conviction. The leader listened, his expression unreadable. When she finished, silence swept the camp. He turned back to the cowboy, studying him like a man weighing gold dust in his hand. Then, slowly, he nodded. "You may speak truth," he said, his tone grave. The younger warrior's face darkened with rage, but he sheathed his knife at the leader's command. The camp's tension shifted, not resolved, but cracked open by doubt. The cowboy realized, in that fragile moment, that his survival didn't come from his revolver or his resolve. It came from an unexpected ally, the very woman who had stood silently in the river, watching him with eyes that already knew his choice. The conflict was no longer just about land or steel. It was about trust. And the fragile thread of it now tied his fate to hers. The night of the council fire bled into morning with no verdict given. The cowboy remained under guard, tied to a post at the edge of camp, his eyes fixed on the glowing embers that refused to die out. When dawn finally stretched across the clearing, the leader rose and motioned for him to stand. The younger warrior glared, hand never far from his blade, but he obeyed his chief's command. This was the moment, the final judgment that would decide whether he lived or whether his blood would join the soil beneath their feet. The leader spoke slowly, his English rough but deliberate. "If what you say is true, then proof must come. Not words. Proof." He gestured toward the horizon, where smoke now trailed thick and dark in the distance. The cowboy's stomach twisted. He knew what that meant. Somewhere out there, the railroad men had already set their plan in motion, torching land to provoke war. The council's eyes turned to him. If he could not stop it, his life was forfeit, and the fragile hope of peace would vanish with him. Escorted by a dozen riders, the cowboy led the way back toward the ridge. The scent of charred wood carried on the wind long before the flames came into sight. When they reached the clearing, the truth lay bare: ranches smoldered, fields blackened, livestock scattered. And standing amid the destruction were hired gunmen in railroad coats, still carrying torches and rifles. The cowboy's heart pounded. This was the evidence he needed, but only if he survived long enough to use it. The Apache riders surged forward, arrows and bullets flying, the earth trembling beneath pounding hooves. The gunmen scattered, caught off guard by the ferocity of the counterattack. The cowboy drew his revolver, fighting shoulder to shoulder with men who hours before had nearly killed him. Smoke thickened the air, choking his lungs, but adrenaline drove him onward. Every shot he fired wasn't just for survival, it was proof, carved into the battlefield, of who the true enemy was. When the last of the railroad men fled, leaving their dead behind, silence returned to the charred ground. The leader rode forward, dismounting beside the cowboy. He bent down, picking up a discarded torch stamped with the railroad's insignia. He held it high for all to see. Murmurs rippled through the riders, some in anger, others in grim respect. The proof was undeniable. For the first time, the weight of suspicion shifted away from the cowboy and toward the men who had sparked the flames of war. Exhausted, the cowboy stood amid the ruin, his body trembling with the effort it had taken to reach this point. The leader approached him, pressing the torch into his hands. "Now you carry truth," he said solemnly. Around them, the riders lowered their weapons, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. The cowboy knew the fight wasn't over, the railroad would return with more men, more fire, but the moment was earned. For the first time, both sides stood on the same ground, bound not by trust, but by necessity. Months passed, and the scars of fire still marked the land. Charred fence posts stood like blackened teeth against the prairie, and the scent of smoke lingered faintly, as if the earth itself refused to forget. Yet life crept back slowly. Grass pushed through the ash, rivers ran clear again, and children's laughter returned to both camps along the valley. The cowboy rode those same trails often, carrying with him the memory of that night, the night when enemies had fought side by side, and the truth had been carved into fire and blood. He was not celebrated in town. Some called him reckless, others branded him a fool for siding with the Apache. Whispers followed him in saloons and on the dusty streets. Yet he did not defend himself, for he knew what they didn't, that silence had saved lives, and the fastest draw hadn't been what stopped the railroad that day. It had been the courage to stand between two worlds and refuse to let either fall. Respect came slowly, not from words, but from the fact that he kept showing up, fixing fences, helping neighbors, living as though nothing had broken him. The Apache village bore its own scars. Families had been displaced, warriors lost, homes burned. Still, when the cowboy rode to the river, he was no longer met with rifles aimed at his chest. Children watched him with curiosity, not suspicion, and men nodded without words as he passed. The three women who had first appeared in the water were there often, standing tall, their silence now softened by recognition. The tallest one would sometimes meet his gaze and incline her head, not in surrender, but in mutual respect. Years later, long after the railroad tracks had been laid in other valleys, the cowboy still returned to that river every spring. There, at the water's edge, he would meet the tribal leader or his children, exchanging gifts of grain, pelts, or tools. It was not a treaty written on paper, nor a pact signed under law. It was an agreement of presence, renewed each year by the simple act of showing up, of remembering. In that quiet exchange, both sides kept alive the memory of what almost destroyed them and what had held them together. On one such day, a boy from the town rode alongside the cowboy, wide-eyed and eager. He asked why the river mattered so much, why the man always returned. The cowboy smiled faintly, watching the sunlight dance across the current. He did not answer right away, for some truths were better carried in silence. Instead, he handed the boy a small feather tied to a strip of leather, a gift given to him long ago, and let the river speak for itself. As the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long, the cowboy whispered the lesson that had come to define his life. Sometimes, in the West, the fastest draw wasn't the one that saved lives, it was the hand that reached out first. With that, he mounted his horse, the boy watching in quiet awe, as the river glimmered behind them like a promise kept. The story of fire and trust had ended, but its echo would ride with them forever.